The silence in the room was louder than the screaming had been. For 10 years, Sarah had learned the geometry of silence, its sharp edges and hollow voids. There was the silence of Kaelin's disapproval, a frigid pressure that could freeze the air in a ballroom. There was the silence of his infidelity, a smug, lingering quiet in the halls after a courtier had been dismissed from his chambers. And there was this, the silence of a life hanging by a thread. His blood, dark and shockingly mortal, stained the Obusal rug, a grotesque flower blooming on a field of woven gold. The royal healer, a vampire whose hands moved with the unnerving calm of centuries, was stitching the gash that split Kaelin's scalp from temple to crown. A mortal wound for any mortal man. For the vampire king, it was merely an insult. An assassin's blade, laced with silver and old magic, had found its mark. It had not killed him, but it had cracked him open. Sarah stood by the hearth, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white stones. She had not moved in an hour. It was a stillness she had perfected, a defense against a husband who saw any sign of life in her as a challenge. Do not feel. Do not react. Do not exist too loudly. These were the first lessons of her marriage. Mordecai, Kaelin's younger brother, watched her from the shadows near the door, his eyes glittering with a predator's patience. He was the architect of her cage, the enforcer of its rules. His presence was a constant, cold weight on her soul, a reminder that her family's lives were the currency of her compliance. "He will wake soon, Your Majesty," the healer murmured, his voice a dry rustle of ancient parchment. He wiped a cloth across Kaelin's pale brow, cleaning away the last of the blood. The wound is closed, the silver's taint is purged, but the skull, the mind is a more delicate mechanism than the body. Sarah gave a nod so small it was barely a movement. She did not dare to hope for anything. Hope was a dangerous, stupid thing, a weed that grew in the cracks of despair only to be ripped out by the root. For 10 years she had learned not to cultivate it. Then his eyes opened. They were the same eyes, the color of a winter sky just before a storm, ringed with a darker gray. She had seen them narrow with contempt, flash with rage, glaze over with boredom. She had seen them look through her as if she were made of glass. But she had never seen them like this. Empty. A clear, depthless gray, holding no memory, no history, no disdain. They swept the room, the healer, the brocade canopy of the bed, the lurking shape of his brother, and then they landed on her. And they stayed. A flicker of something moved in their depths, not recognition, curiosity. He was looking at her. Not through her, not past her, but at her. His brow furrowed in a gentle, confused line. The motion was so alien on his features that it made her breath catch. Kaelin did not get confused. He was a creature of absolute, cutting certainty. His voice was a rasp, raw from disuse. He tried to push himself up on his elbows, and a fresh wave of pain washed over his face. He fell back against the pillows with a soft groan. His gaze, however, never left hers. He looked at her as if she were the only fixed point in a spinning world. "Who are you?" The question struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her carefully constructed stillness shattered. The air left her lungs in a silent rush. 10 years. 3,652 days of being his wife, his property, his queen. And he did not know her. Mordecai took a step forward from the shadows, his silhouette sharpening, and the sound was enough to rebuild her walls in an instant. The threat was still there, a coiled serpent in the corner of the room. She took a breath, schooling her features back into the placid mask of a queen. "I am Sarah," she said, her voice even, betraying nothing of the earthquake that had just torn through her. "I am your wife." He was a king without a kingdom, a tyrant without a throne. He was a man who had lost 1,000 years of memory, and the woman he had spent a decade trying to break. She was his wife, bound by a vow he could not recall to a life of gilded misery. A decade of cruelty had been wiped clean by an assassin's blade, leaving only a terrible, fragile blankness in its wake. This was not a reprieve. It was a reckoning, a war to be fought not with swords, but in the devastating silence between a question he could not remember asking and an answer she could not bear to give. The days that followed were a study in surreal tension. The castle held its breath, a collective inhale of fear and uncertainty. Kaelin, the king whose moods could shift the political climate of the entire continent, was now a stranger in his own halls. He moved through his life like a ghost, his eyes wide with a quiet, constant wonder that was profoundly unsettling to everyone who had known him before. He touched the velvet draperies as if discovering their texture for the first time. He stood before portraits of his own ancestors with the detached curiosity of a tourist. And he watched Sarah. He watched her with an intensity that unnerved her more than his old cruelty ever had. It was not the possessive, assessing gaze she was used to, the look that measured her worth and always found it wanting. This was different. It was searching. He seemed to be looking for a reflection of himself in her, a clue to the man he had been. "My lady," he said one morning, his voice still soft with the lingering weakness of his injury. They were in the library, a cavernous room she had always used as a sanctuary because he had despised it. Now he was here, running a hand over the spines of books he had supposedly read 100 times. He turned to her, and the light from the high, arched windows caught the silver threads in his black hair. "The healer said you have been my wife for 10 years. "Yes," she said, her voice a carefully neutral thing. She was arranging a vase of winter roses, her focus narrowed to the placement of each thorned stem. It was easier than looking at him. "That is a long time," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He took a hesitant step closer. "I apologize. It must be strange to have a husband who is a stranger to you." The irony of it was so thick it nearly choked her. "He was always a stranger to me," she wanted to scream. "The only difference is that now you are a kinder one." But Mordecai's threat was a physical presence in every room, a gag in her mouth. Her family, her gentle, mortal, fragile family, lived under the shadow of his whim. So she simply pressed a thorn into her thumb, the small, sharp pain a welcome anchor. "It is a difficult situation for us both." He was beside her now. She could feel the warmth radiating from him, a warmth she had only ever felt when he was in a rage. She flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible tightening of her shoulders, a reflex carved into her by a decade of bracing for impact. He saw it. His gaze dropped to her hands, then back to her face. The curiosity in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of something else, confusion, and a shadow of what looked like hurt. Do I frighten you?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. A single word, a single honest word, could bring everything crashing down. Mordecai had been clear. "The king is the king," he had hissed at her the day after the attack, his fingers biting into her arm. "His nature is unchanged, whether he remembers it or not. You will act as you always have. You will not fill his head with sentiment or weakness, or your sister will learn what it is to be truly cherished by a vampire." The memory of that threat was a brand on her skin. She forced a smile, a brittle, painful thing that felt like breaking glass. "You are the king," she said, echoing the words of her tormentor. "It is my duty to respect you, not to fear you." The answer did not seem to satisfy him. He looked at her for a long moment, his winter sky eyes searching hers for a truth she could not afford to give. He reached out, his hand hovering in the air between them for a heartbeat, before he seemed to think better of it and let it drop to his side. Of course, he said, his voice now laced with a formality that was a distant echo of his old self. But the look in his eyes was not cold. It was lost. And in that moment, seeing this powerful, ancient creature so utterly adrift, she felt the first treacherous stirring of an emotion she had buried alive 10 years ago. Pity. It was a dangerous feeling, more dangerous than hope, because it felt almost like connection. He began to court her. It was the only word for it. In the absence of memory, he had only the present, and in the present, she was the woman who was his wife, the one constant in his fractured reality. He treated their marriage not as a decade-old political arrangement, but as a new and delicate thing to be nurtured. It started with questions. Not interrogations about his past, but small, curious inquiries about her. "What is this flower?" he asked one afternoon, pointing to the white blossoms in the gardens. "Hellebore," she answered automatically. "They call it the winter rose." "It's beautiful," he said, his eyes on her face, not the flower. "Is it your favorite?" The question was so simple, so mundane, it disarmed her completely. In 10 years, he had never asked her such a thing. He had never cared to know the contents of her mind beyond her ability to be silent and decorative. I suppose it is," she stammered. "It's one of the few things that thrives in the cold." The next morning, a single, perfect hellebore was lying on her pillow when she woke. There was no note. There didn't need to be. She stared at it, her chest tight. It was a kind gesture, a thoughtful one. And it terrified her. Kindness was a language he had never spoken, and she had forgotten how to understand it. She felt a wave of self-loathing so intense it made her dizzy. How pathetic she was, to be undone by a single flower. This was the man who had paraded his lovers before her, who had dismissed her opinions with a flick of his wrist, who had made her feel like a ghost in her own life. This was a trick of the mind, a temporary reprieve before the monster she knew returned. But he was relentlessly, confoundingly gentle. He would wait for her to join him for meals, a courtesy he had never once extended before. He would listen, truly listen, when she spoke to the court steward about the household, his head tilted, as if her words were the most fascinating thing he had ever heard. He started a new custom, one that sent ripples of shock through the court. After the evening meal, he would dismiss everyone but her. "Stay," he'd said the first time, his voice quiet but firm. "Tell me about your day." Sarah had frozen, her mind racing to decipher the command. Was it a test? A new, subtle form of cruelty? She had given him a sanitized, brief account of her afternoon, expecting mockery or dismissal. Instead, he'd simply nodded. "It sounds peaceful," he'd said. "I'm glad." And so it became their ritual. In the great hall with a fire crackling in the hearth that did little to warm the cavernous space, she would speak and he would listen. She started small, with safe, impersonal topics. The books she was reading, the progress of her needlework. But his quiet, patient attention was a key turning a lock deep inside her. Slowly, hesitantly, she began to share more. She told him about the small village where she grew up, about the scent of rain on the fields after a dry spell, about her father's booming laugh. She spoke of a life before him, a self she had thought long dead and buried. He never spoke of his own past, of the gaping void in his mind. He seemed content to build a new world, one that started and ended with these quiet moments with her. One evening, as she was describing the way the light hit the hills at sunset in her homeland, he reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. Her entire body went rigid. His touch. For a decade, his touch had been ownership. A grip on her arm to lead her. A hand on the small of her back to display her. A cold, perfunctory act in the marriage bed. It was never gentle. It was never a question. This was. His fingers were warm, his hold light, a silent offering. He didn't pull her closer or demand a response. He just held her hand, his thumb stroking softly over her knuckles. She looked from their joined hands to his face. He was watching her with an expression of such open, unguarded tenderness that it felt like staring into the sun. "Sarah," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. "You are remarkable." And in the flickering firelight, with the ghosts of 1,000 cruelties watching from the shadows, Sarah Vance did the one thing she had sworn she would never do again. She began to fall in love with her husband. The hatred she felt for herself was a bitter, burning poison in her throat. She was falling for a phantom, a beautiful lie wearing the face of her destroyer, and she was powerless to stop it. Mordecai was a serpent in their fragile Eden. He watched the burgeoning warmth between his brother and his wife with a cold, reptilian fury. He had spent years cultivating Caelan's cruelty, nurturing his paranoia, feeding the darkest parts of his nature. Caelan's coldness had given Mordecai power, influence, and the freedom to indulge his own sadistic appetites under the king's formidable shadow. This new Caelan, this thoughtful, gentle man who looked at his wife with something akin to reverence, was a threat to everything Mordecai had built. He began to test the boundaries of Caelan's amnesia, peppering his conversation with casual references to a past Caelan couldn't recall. "Do you remember the Yule Festival 5 years ago?" he asked one afternoon in the throne room, his voice slick with feigned nostalgia. "When you had that little singer from the southern province, the one with the red hair? Gods, she had a voice like an angel and the morals of an alley cat. You were quite taken with her for a time." Sarah, standing by the dais, felt the blood drain from her face. She remembered that Yule. She remembered the singer's mocking eyes on her across the great hall. She remembered Caelan's hand, possessively on the small of the girl's back, while Sarah stood beside him, a frozen statue of a queen. Caelan's brow furrowed. He looked from his brother to Sarah, catching the flicker of pain in her eyes before she could mask it. "I don't recall," he said, his voice clipped, "and I find the topic distasteful." "Distasteful?" Mordecai laughed, a sharp, ugly sound. "Brother, you were never one for taste. You were one for appetite, for power. Don't tell me a knock on the head has turned you into a monk." "It has turned me into a man who respects his wife," Caelan replied, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone that was a chilling echo of the king he'd once been. But the danger was not directed at her. It was directed at Mordecai in her defense. "Something you would do well to remember." Mordecai's smile tightened, but he inclined his head in a mock bow. "Of course, my king. My apologies to the queen." His eyes met Sarah's over his brother's shoulder, and they were filled with a venomous promise. He cornered her later, in the long, shadowed gallery of portraits. She had come for a moment of peace, and found none. Mordecai materialized from an alcove blocking her path. "You are playing a very dangerous game," he hissed, his proximity an invasion. "I am playing no game," Sarah said, forcing her voice to remain steady, her gaze fixed on the portrait of a long-dead queen behind him. "Don't lie to me," he snarled, taking a step closer. The scent of cloying cologne and old blood clung to him. "I see how you look at him. I see how he looks at you. This tender little romance you're cultivating, do you think it will last? Do you think the man who burned a village to the ground for a perceived slight is gone forever?" Her breath hitched. She had not known about the village. It was another stone added to the mountain of his sins. "He is a predator, Sarah, a tiger. You've simply found him while he is sleeping, and you are whispering pleasant dreams into his ear. When he wakes up, and he will wake up, he will still have claws and teeth, and he will remember who taught him to be gentle. He will see it as a weakness you fostered in him, a betrayal." Mordecai's face was inches from hers now, his voice a sibilant whisper. "And I will be there to remind him. Then he will turn on you, and I will let him. But your family, their fate will be in my hands. I am far more creative in my cruelties than my brother ever was. Do you understand me?" The threat was not veiled. It was a naked blade held to her throat. Every kind word from Kalin, every gentle touch, was now tainted with this new layer of fear. She was not just betraying the memory of her own suffering by falling for him, she was actively endangering the people she loved most. She pulled away from Mordecai, her heart a block of ice in her chest. "I understand," she said, the words tasting like ash. That night, she tried to pull away from Kalin. When he reached for her hand after dinner, she clasped her own in her lap. When he asked about her day, she gave clipped one-word answers. She tried to rebuild the wall between them, brick by painful brick. He did not get angry. He did not press her. He simply watched her, his gaze filled with a patient, sorrowful understanding. The fire crackled in the oppressive silence. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet and heavy. "Someone has been speaking to you," he said. It wasn't a question. "Mordecai." Sarah did not answer. She could not. "He is telling you things about me, about the man I was." He sighed, a weary human sound. "I see it in the way you look at me now. The fear is back in your eyes. I had hoped it was gone." He stood and walked to the great window, looking out at the snow-blanketed courtyard. His reflection was a faint, troubled ghost on the dark glass. "I don't know what I did, Sarah. I have this chasm inside me where a lifetime should be. But I know it was dark. I can feel the shape of it. I feel it in the way the guards flinch when I approach. I hear it in the whispers that stop when I enter a room. And I see it in you. You are the clearest mirror I have, and the reflection you show me, it is of a monster." He turned back to her, and the raw vulnerability on his face was her undoing. "Whatever I was," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name, "that man is not who I am now. I know that in my soul. Please, don't let his ghost punish us both." He was begging her. The Vampire King, a creature of legend and terror, was begging her for a chance. Mordecai's threats screamed in her mind, but the desperate hope in Kalin's eyes screamed louder. In that moment, she made a choice. It was a reckless, foolish choice, born of a love she had no right to feel. She chose the man in front of her over the monster in her memory. She rose from her chair, crossed the space between them, and for the first time in 10 years of marriage, she went to her husband and willingly, tentatively, placed her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, a desperate, grateful grip. It did not feel like a cage. It felt like an anchor. The fragile piece they had built was a glass house in a hurricane, beautiful and doomed. But for a few precious weeks, they lived within it. Kalin, starved for connection and genuine feeling, devoted himself to learning her. Not just her history, but her very essence. He discovered the way a small smile touched her lips before it reached her eyes, the way she worried her lower lip when she was deep in thought, the specific shade of green her eyes turned in the morning light. This meticulous attention was a form of worship, and it slowly, painstakingly, began to heal wounds inside her she thought were fatal. They found a quiet rhythm, a domesticity that had been unthinkable before. He would spend his mornings poring over royal ledgers and maps, trying to relearn the kingdom he ruled, his brow furrowed in concentration. She would sit with him in the library, the scratch of his quill a comforting counterpoint to the rustle of her pages. He would ask her questions about trade routes and political alliances, and he listened to her answers with a respect that stunned her. He valued her mind. The old Kalin had treated her intellect as an inconvenient and unattractive accessory. This Kalin seemed to find it enthralling. "You understand these things better than any of my advisors," he said one afternoon, looking up from a treaty. "Why were you not at council meetings?" "You forbade it," she answered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. A shadow passed over his face. "Of course I did," he murmured, turning back to the parchment. He did not press her for details, but she saw the way his jaw tightened. He was collecting these small, painful truths, piecing together a mosaic of his former self. And he clearly did not like the image that was emerging. One night, a fierce winter storm descended upon the castle, rattling the windows and howling through the stone corridors. The wind was a lonely, keening sound that echoed the emptiness Sarah had carried in her heart for so long. They sat by the fire in Kaelin's private chambers, a place she had not entered willingly in years. He had asked her to read to him from an old book of mortal myths. She chose a story of a mortal woman and a god of the underworld, a tale of captivity that became something more. Her voice was low and steady as she read, the words painting pictures in the warm, firelit air. Kaelin sat on the floor at her feet, his back against her chair, his head resting near her knee. He was utterly still, listening. The sheer domesticity of the moment was so overwhelming that her voice thickened with unshed tears. She faltered, a word catching in her throat. "Sarah?" he asked softly, without turning. "It's nothing," she whispered, trying to regain her composure. He shifted, turning to look up at her. His hand came to rest on her knee, a warm, solid weight. "It's not nothing," he said gently. His eyes were dark with concern. "Talk to me." And so she did. She didn't tell him about his cruelty, not directly. She couldn't. But she told him about the loneliness. She spoke of the isolation of being a mortal queen in an immortal court, of the feeling of being a decorative object, seen but never known. She spoke of the crushing weight of a decade of silence. He listened, his gaze never leaving her face. When she finished, her voice trailing off into a whisper, he didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply tightened his hand on her knee and said, "You will never be lonely again. I swear it." Later, as the storm raged outside, he stood and pulled her to her feet. He led her not to the bed, but to the large velvet-cushioned window seat overlooking the tempest. They sat together, shoulders touching, and watched the snow swirl in the darkness. "I feel," he began, his voice a low rumble, "as though I was asleep for a very long time. And I've only just woken up, and the first thing I saw was you." He turned to her, his face illuminated by a sudden flash of lightning. There were lines of strain around his eyes, the burden of his missing past. "I don't know who I was, Sarah. I don't know if I can ever be a good man, but I want to be a good husband. To you." He leaned in, his movement slow, giving her every chance to pull away. He was asking permission. His lips touched hers, and it was nothing like the kisses she remembered. His past kisses had been hard, demanding, acts of possession. This was a question. It was tentative, soft, and full of a breathtaking tenderness. It was a kiss of discovery. She did not pull away. Her hand came up to cup his jaw, and she leaned into him, answering his question with her own. For the first time, she was not a passive recipient of his desires. She was an active participant. It was a kiss of equals, a fragile pact made in the heart of a storm. In that moment, the glass house did not feel so doomed. It felt like a home. And the hope she had so long denied herself bloomed in the ruins of her heart. A fierce and terrifying winter rose. The first crack in their fragile world appeared a week later. It was subtle, a flicker in the placid surface of their new life. Kaelin had been in the armory, inspecting the ancestral weapons that lined the walls. He picked up a heavy black iron gauntlet, its surface etched with silver runes. As his fingers traced the cold metal, his eyes unfocused. The world around him dissolved into a dizzying vortex of sound and color. The scent of rain on cold stone, the flickering torchlight of the western ramparts, her face, pale and luminous in the gloom, her hair a dark banner whipped by the wind. Tears tracked clean paths through the grime on her cheeks. Her voice, raw with grief and fury. "You promised!" she was screaming at him, her small fists beating uselessly against his chest plate. "You gave me your word they would be safe!" His own hand, encased in this very gauntlet, rising. Not to strike her, to cup her face. But there was no tenderness in the gesture, it was a silencing. His voice, a cold, bored baritone that was horribly, intimately familiar. Your family's safety is conditional upon your obedience. You have been disobedient. This is the consequence. He remembered the way she crumpled, the fight draining out of her, leaving only a hollow, broken thing behind. Kaelan staggered back, dropping the gauntlet with a deafening clang. He pressed the heels of his hands to his temples, a guttural sound of distress tearing from his throat. The memory, no, the feeling, was so vivid. The cold satisfaction, the casual cruelty. It coated his tongue like poison. It was him. He knew it with a certainty that was bone-deep and horrifying. He had looked at her, weeping, and felt nothing. Less than nothing. He had felt annoyance at her emotional display. He fled the armory, his heart pounding with a sick, frantic rhythm. He found Sarah in the solar, arranging dried herbs in small linen bags. She looked up as he entered, a soft smile gracing her lips. The sight of it was a physical blow. That smile was a gift he did not deserve, a treasure he had apparently spent years trying to grind into dust. "Kaelan?" she asked, her smile fading as she saw the look on his face. "Are you all right? You're as pale as a ghost." He couldn't speak. He couldn't look at her without seeing the other version of her, the weeping, broken girl on the ramparts. He saw his own hand, a weaponized thing, silencing her. He looked down at his hands now, horrified. Had these hands hurt her? I am unwell," he managed to say, his voice strained. "I need to be alone." He turned and left before she could respond, leaving her standing in a cloud of lavender and confusion. He locked himself in his study, the memory replaying itself in his mind, each viewing more agonizing than the last. It wasn't just an image, it was a full sensory experience. He could feel the cold metal of the gauntlet against her skin, smell the rain, taste the ash of his own cruelty. This was what Mordecai had hinted at. This was the monster in the reflection. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. He had been building a new life, a new self, on a foundation of lies. He had been falling in love with a woman who had every reason to despise him. The fear he had seen in her eyes, the flinch he had worked so hard to erase, it wasn't just a reaction to a stranger's power. It was a learned response. He had trained her to fear him. The realization was a shard of ice in his gut, twisting and turning. He was not just a stranger to her. He was her tormentor. And he hadn't even had the decency to remember his own sins. The fragments began to come more frequently after that, like slivers of a shattered mirror, each one reflecting a more monstrous version of himself. They were never a coherent narrative, just visceral sensory flashes, often triggered by a place or an object. A walk down the northern hall brought a memory of his own laughter, sharp and mocking, as Sarah stumbled over a loose flagstone. He remembered watching her fall to her knees, her hands scraped and bleeding, and feeling a flicker of dark amusement. He hadn't offered her a hand. He had simply walked on. He found a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird in a dusty corner of a cabinet. The moment he touched it, he was plunged into another memory. Sarah, younger, her face still holding a softness that had long since been erased. She was showing him the bird, a gift she had carved herself. "It's a nightingale," she'd said, her voice full of a shy pride. "For you." He remembered taking it from her, examining the delicate workmanship. And then he remembered his own words, delivered with a casual, soul-crushing dismissiveness. "I have no use for trinkets." He had tossed it onto a table, where it slid and fell to the floor. He hadn't bothered to pick it up. He had simply turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, her face crumbling. He found the bird, years later, tucked away and forgotten, a symbol of her offered heart, which he had discarded as easily as a piece of trash. With each new piece, his horror grew. He began a quiet, desperate investigation. He couldn't ask Sarah. He couldn't bear to make her relive the pain, to see the confirmation of his monstrosity in her eyes. He couldn't ask Mordecai, whose answers would be poisoned with his own agenda, so he turned to the silent witnesses of his reign, the castle staff. He approached an old groom in the stables, a man who had served his father before him. The man's hands trembled as Kaelin spoke to him. His fear was a wall. "Tell me," Kaelin said, his voice quiet, stripped of all command. "Tell me about the queen. Was she happy?" The old man stared at the cobblestones, unable to meet the king's eye. "The queen is dutiful, Your Majesty," he mumbled, the words carefully chosen. "That's not what I asked," Kaelin pressed, his voice raw with desperation. "Look at me. Was she happy?" The groom finally lifted his gaze, and in his watery old eyes, Kaelin saw a universe of pity. Not for him, but for Sarah. "No, my king," the man whispered, his voice cracking. "She was not." The simple, devastating answer was worse than any accusation. It was a statement of fact, a truth the entire castle had known, a sorrow they had all witnessed. He was the king, and he had been the sole architect of his wife's misery. The chasm inside him was no longer empty. It was filling up with shame, with a self-loathing so profound it threatened to swallow him whole. He started connecting the flashes of memory to the woman who stood before him now. He saw the faint silvery scars on her hands and remembered the image of her falling. He noticed the way she never offered him her opinion unless directly asked, and he remembered the sound of his own voice, dismissing her thoughts as worthless. He saw the careful, guarded stillness she held herself in, and he recognized it as the posture of a creature living in a predator's cage. He had done this. He had taken the vibrant, proud woman who had carved a nightingale with her own hands and systematically, piece by piece, dismantled her. The gentle, loving man he had become was living in a house built by a tyrant, and the foundations were beginning to crumble. He knew he had to confront her. He had to know the full extent of it. He owed her the dignity of the truth, no matter how much it destroyed him. He dreaded it more than he had ever dreaded an assassin's blade. He found her on the battlements, the same western ramparts from his first terrible memory fragment. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of snow and pine from the distant mountains. It whipped her dark hair across her face as she stared out at the sprawling lands of his kingdom. Her kingdom. She looked small and terribly alone against the vast, gray sky. He approached her slowly, his footsteps loud on the stone. She didn't startle. He knew she had heard him long before he was near. Her hypervigilance was another of his terrible gifts to her. She turned as he stopped beside her, her expression unreadable. For a long time, neither of them spoke. They simply stood together, a king and queen, separated by an ocean of unspoken pain. "I remember this place," he said finally, his voice rough. He didn't look at her, keeping his gaze fixed on the horizon. "There was a storm. You were crying." He felt her stiffen beside him. This was it, the precipice. "I remember my hand," he continued, his voice dropping to a broken whisper. "In a gauntlet. I remember silencing you." He finally forced himself to look at her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and sorrow. "I'm starting to remember things, Sarah. Fragments. Flashes of the man I was." He took a breath, the cold air burning his lungs. He had to ask. He had to know. He owed her that much. He turned to face her fully, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. He made no move to touch her, to bridge the gap between them. He had forfeited that right. "I have seen myself through your eyes for weeks now. I have seen a man I could respect. A man I wanted to be." His voice cracked. He looked into her eyes, the beautiful, haunted eyes of the woman he loved, the woman he had destroyed. "But that's not the whole truth, is it? The pieces I'm remembering, they are ugly." He swallowed, the next words the hardest he had ever spoken. Sarah, was I a monster? The wind howled around them, pulling at her cloak, whipping a strand of hair across her lips. She didn't brush it away. Her eyes, those clear, green-flecked mirrors, held his. He saw a decade of pain reflected there, a deep, sorrowful ocean of it. He saw the memory of every cold word, every dismissive gesture, every casual cruelty. He saw the nights she had cried herself to sleep, and the days she had walked through the castle like a beautiful, haunted doll. He saw the woman she had been, and the woman he had forced her to become. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her silence was his answer. It was his confession. It was his verdict. And in the terrible, quiet space between them, the last vestiges of the man he thought he was died, and the full, horrifying weight of the man he had been crashed down upon him. He had not just been a monster. He had been her monster. And the knowledge was a more grievous wound than any assassin's blade. He closed his eyes, and for the first time in 1,000 years, Kaelin, the Vampire King, felt the unfamiliar, scalding shame of tears. The truth did not shatter him. It remade him. In the devastating clarity of Sarah's silence, Kaelin found a new, terrible purpose. It was not enough to be a different man in his own mind. He had to become a different king in the world. He had to dismantle the kingdom of fear he had built, stone by blood-soaked stone. His first act was to confront Mordecai. He found his brother in the treasury, admiring the royal coffers as if they were his own. Mordecai looked up as he entered, a smug, knowing smile on his lips. "So," he said, his voice dripping with condescending pity, "the prodigal monster returns to his senses. Did our little queen finally tell you bedtime stories about the big bad wolf?" Kaelin walked toward him, his movements slow, deliberate. There was no rage in his eyes, none of the hot fury his brother was accustomed to provoking. There was something far colder, far more absolute. It was the calm of a settled conviction. "You fed my paranoia," Kaelin said, his voice low and even. "You encouraged my cruelty. You used my worst instincts as your shield, and you thrived in the darkness I cast. You took my weakness and called it strength, and I was fool enough to believe you." Mordecai's smile faltered. "Brother, I only ever had your best interests at heart. I protected you, our legacy." "You protected yourself," Kaelin corrected him, stopping just before him. "And you used Sarah's family to control her, to ensure she would never be a softening influence on me. You threatened her. You threatened them." It was not a question. He saw the truth in the flicker of panic in his brother's eyes. "She is a mortal, a temporary plaything. Her family is insignificant," Mordecai spat, his composure cracking. "She is my wife," Kaelin said, the words ringing with an authority that had been absent for weeks. It was not the authority of a tyrant, but of a king who finally understood the meaning of his vows. "And you are a viper I have allowed in my house for too long." He did not raise his voice. He did not draw a weapon. He simply placed a hand on his brother's shoulder, and Mordecai flinched as if struck. "You are banished. Your titles are forfeit. Your lands are seized. You will leave this castle by sunrise and never return. If you are found within the borders of my kingdom by the next full moon, you will be hunted down and executed not as a noble, but as a common traitor. The sentence is absolute." Mordecai stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. "You cannot do this. I am your brother." "You were my keeper," Kaelin said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "And my reign as a caged animal is over." He turned and walked away, leaving Mordecai standing amidst the gold that could no longer buy him influence, his power broken not by a show of force, but by a quiet, irrevocable judgment. His next act was for Sarah. He sent a royal decree, sealed with his own hand and delivered by his most trusted captain, to her family's estate. It granted them a new, protected title, lands twice the size of their old holdings, and a permanent royal guard. The decree stated, in language that left no room for interpretation, that any threat against the Vance family would be considered a direct act of treason against the crown. He was not just freeing them from Mordecai's shadow, he was placing them under his own absolute, permanent protection. He did not tell Sarah he had done it. It was not a gift to be thanked for. It was a debt being paid, a fraction of the restitution he owed. He began to change the way he ruled. He reopened his council meetings, and this time he insisted Sarah sit at his right hand. The first time, the old grizzled lords and ancient vampire advisors stared, shocked into silence. But Kaelin would not begin until she was seated. He listened to their counsel, but he would often turn to her. "And what is your opinion, my queen?" he would ask, his voice clear and respectful in the quiet room. Her insights were sharp, compassionate, and wise. She saw the human cost of their political maneuverings. Slowly, hesitantly at first, and then with growing confidence, she became his most trusted advisor. He was not just giving her a voice, he was finally listening to it. He spent his days relearning what it meant to be a king, and his nights relearning what it meant to be a husband. The tenderness did not vanish after his revelation. It deepened, tempered now with a profound, aching remorse. He never pushed her, never demanded forgiveness he had not earned. He gave her space, but he was always present, a quiet, constant source of support. He still brought her flowers. He sought out the rarest blossoms, cultivating a garden in a sun-drenched, glass-roofed conservatory he had built for her. He learned that she loved the scent of jasmine, the deep purple of irises, the delicate fragility of poppies. Each bouquet was a silent apology, a quiet promise. He still asked her about her day, but now the question held a deeper weight. He was not just making conversation, he was checking in, ensuring that no shadow, new or old, had fallen across her. He was learning the topography of her peace and standing guard over it. Healing was not a straight line. It was a slow, meandering path with setbacks and stumbles. There were days when a raised voice from a guard in the courtyard would make her flinch, and the shame and pain in Kaelin's eyes would be a raw, open wound. There were nights when she would wake from a nightmare, the phantom chill of his old cruelty clinging to her, and he would be there, sitting in a chair across the room, watching over her, giving her the solace of his presence without the intrusion of his touch, until she sought it herself. His memories never fully returned. They remained a collection of horrific fragments, a constant reminder of the man he had been. He did not see them as a curse anymore, but as a penance. They were his ghosts, and he would carry them forever. They kept him humble. They kept him vigilant. One evening, months later, they were in the library. A soft rain was falling outside, a gentle drumming on the leaded glass windows. Sarah was reading, and Kaelin was watching her, as he often did. He was no longer trying to find himself in her reflection. He was simply appreciating her, the quiet strength that had allowed her to survive him, the grace that allowed her to sit in the same room with him now. She looked up, as if feeling his gaze, and offered him a small, genuine smile. The sight of it still had the power to stop his heart. "What is it?" she asked softly. "Nothing," he said, his voice thick. "Everything." He stood and walked over to her, kneeling before her chair. He didn't reach for her, he simply knelt, his head bowed, a king in supplication to his queen. "Sarah," he began, his voice breaking, "I know that sorry is a meaningless word. It cannot undo a decade of pain. It cannot give you back the years I stole from you. But it is all I have. I am sorry for every moment of fear, every moment of loneliness. I am so, so sorry." She looked down at the man at her feet, the man who wore her husband's face. He was the ghost and the reality, the wound and the balm. She saw the weight of his guilt, a burden he carried every single day. She saw the unwavering dedication in his eyes, the relentless effort he put into being a man worthy of her. She reached out, her hand hesitating for a fraction of a second before she gently placed it on his head, her fingers sinking into his dark, silver-streaked hair. It was a gesture of comfort, of acceptance, of absolution. He looked up, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I know, Kaylin," she whispered, and her voice held no fear, only a deep, quiet, and hard-won peace. He didn't ask for her love. He didn't ask for her to forget. He simply spent the rest of his long, eternal reign becoming someone she never had to fear again. And in time, in the quiet spaces they built together, in the shared glances and gentle touches, Sarah found that the love she felt for the man he had become was stronger than the memory of the monster he had been. It was a different kind of love than the innocent affection of her youth. It was a scarred, resilient thing, a winter rose that had not only survived the cold, but had learned to bloom in it.